Start on time and finish on time, and we shall try and do that today. Welcome to everyone in the room and welcome to those online. 4 years ago, the then Prime Minister Theresa May stood here at Policy Exchange to launch a report into post-18 education in England. I chaired the panel that produced it. The report celebrated our world-class universities, but also drew attention to our neglected further education sector, a neglect the panel tackled through proposals to reform and refund technical and vocational education. In higher education, our recommendations addressed the balance between public and private funding, tried to secure better value for learners and taxpayers, and to increase support for the disadvantaged. On fees, we tried to balance the multiple pressures of sustainable funding, affordability, fairness, and access. We recommended extending the existing freeze on the unit of resource per student until 2023, replacing part of the student fee with a directed government grant, and increasing the fee in line with inflation from 2023. A lot has happened since then, including a partial refunding of FE, a Skills Act, changes to student loans to reduce the write-off, a lifelong learning bill, and the emergence of a vigorous, quality-oriented regulator. It's quite a list, but here we are in 2023, the last year of the panel's proposed fee freeze, with no change in the unit of resource until at least 2025. Whether the sector can absorb a further real terms cut is perhaps a moot point, but few of us would welcome a repeat of the recent pattern, in which a dramatic thaw is followed by a long freeze. That leads to a land grab, penalises some cohorts, and is simply bad business, and I feel bad policy. Much better would be a sustainable funding model that is fair to students and taxpayers, and helps the universities plan for the future. It's really important that we get this right. Universities are our best hope of remaining at the cutting edge of the global economy. They invigorate our towns and cities. They transform students' life chances. They are a massive national asset that must not be allowed to waste, and that is the risk we run unless we can find a sustainable, affordable, fair funding model. There are no simple answers to this, but to help us, we have a distinguished panel. Professors Sir Steve Smith and Karen O'Brien will set the scene, and then former Universities and Science Minister Lord Johnson, former Education Secretary Justine Greening, and Policy Exchange Research Director Iain Mansfield will outline three proposals. We'll wrap up with questions and close at 13:45. First, speaking about HE at the Crossroads, Professor O'Brien, Vice-Chancellor of Durham University, who've kindly supported this event. Karen, over to you.
Thank you. As a Vice-Chancellor, I am conscious of the immense privilege of playing a leadership role in the UK's outstanding university system, a system that is the cornerstone of our democracy, generating globally transformative ideas, discoveries and technologies, and contributing around £26 billion per annum to the UK economy. We have one of the highest university participation rates in the world, exceptionally low dropouts, and comparatively high levels of spending per student. Our graduates still enjoy a significant earnings premium at both undergraduate and postgraduate levels, and demonstrably boost economic growth. I do not need to rehearse in this company the importance and strengths of UK higher education, and I am grateful that we are all here to consider ways in which to strengthen our great universities. But this system is under strain. Some of these strains have been for some time inherent in the model whereby universities do not recover the full economic costs of publicly funded or charity-funded research. And some relate to the long-term chronic underfunding for high-cost science and medical subjects, such that the top-up rate for a chemistry undergraduate is now only £1,587 per year. we have also seen sharp rises in the overhead costs of our USS and TPS pension schemes. But many strains are very recent, owing to the inflationary erosion of the already static home undergraduate fee. It no longer covers the cost of delivering even comparatively cheap subjects like my own. And then in the short term, we have soaring utility costs of student accommodation, data centres, and highly serviced labs. Universities have sounded the alarm in the past, but have carried on calmly. In the last year, however, the National Audit Office itself has drawn attention to worrying indicators of financial unsustainability, including liquidity concerns and a growing aggregate net in-year deficit for the sector. The alarm rings in Vice-Chancellor's ears every day. As we scramble to cross-subsidise losses in home undergraduate education and research through overseas student recruitment, there is a danger that we are not preparing adequately for the coming UK demographic spike. Allowing for a slight post-COVID correction, young applicants for undergraduate places are already at an all-time high, not only in the UK, but around the world. UCAS expects this number to reach 1 million by 2030. While rates of growth in international student numbers have been much faster in the past decade, thus far there has been little to suggest that this has been at the expense of opportunities for home students. But there is a very real risk this may change as demand continues to rise and as universities with a de facto civic student number cap and accommodation shortages exchange home for international student places. The significant improvements we have made in entry rates for the most disadvantaged students may be slowed down by market-driven constraints on home student numbers. And on the other side of the coin, there are well-understood geopolitical risks to those overseas student markets, as well as security concerns about overdependence on China. Most concerning of all, we are at risk of breaking our social contract with our UK student population and backtracking on hard-won social equality gains. Barely inflated maintenance loans cover less and less of the cost of study, and universities struggle to bridge widening gaps for provision for hardship, disability, and mental health. We may also be starting to see a downturn in the numbers of UK students proceeding to master's programmes. Many can no longer bear the costs of continuing to live as a student. In the meantime, we have yet to deliver as a sector on a meaningful, accessible framework for a lifelong learning entitlement, of which many of us think that master's programmes should be a part. As the director of the LSE wrote in yesterday's Financial Times, we have an opportunity now to return to a national conversation about the financial unsustainability of tertiary education as a whole on a cross-party basis. This conversation has 3 dimensions: the cost of study, the cost of delivering research, impact and education, and the cost to the taxpayer. In relation to this 3rd dimension, it is fair to say that university leaders do not expect that we will see any significant increases in public funding in the near future. Rather, we need a re-engineered financial model, one that encourages a more flexible, disaggregated approach to lifelong education, enables the further scaling up of high-cost science subjects, and allows UK students to pursue conversion master's programmes in areas such as digital skills. We need a system that promotes alignment rather than competition between universities and FE, one that encourages a balanced and planned approach to ratios of overseas and home students in a way that makes sense for cities and regions, and one that is grounded in a long-term view about what we want from universities for sustainable growth and the enrichment of lives. I look forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Our next speaker is Professor Sir Steve Smith. Steve is an expert in international relations. He's a former Vice-Chancellor of Exeter University, and he's currently the Government International Education Champion. He's speaking here to give an overview of international funding systems and is not able to comment on UK student financing and funding or wider questions of government policy. Steve.
So I'm not really going to say anything at all. No, thanks, Philip. Look, funding higher education is very complex. It involves making decisions about the level of investment needed, the balance of fees and government grants, and what strategic priorities to support. Internationally, my contention will be that there's no silver bullet that solves all the problems. You have to make conscious, not unconscious, choices. It reminds me of the old adage in my area of social sciences that economics is the study of how men and women make choices, and sociology is the study of why they have no choices to make. So there's a variety of systems out there, and today I'm going to talk about 3 to give you some background of the core trade-offs. The first is Australia. Public higher education providers in Australia are largely supported through a mixture of government grants and tuition fee income. But a key difference with England is that tuition costs vary by subject. The Australian government's Commonwealth Grant Scheme provides a subsidy for tuition costs for students on CSPs, Commonwealth Supported Places. The level of government grant subsidy per student differs by subject cluster, and the provider's total Commonwealth Grant Scheme grant is capped. Student contributions, i.e. tuition fees, on these CSPs, Commonwealth Supported Places, are typically financed through upfront government-funded income contingent loans and vary by subject cluster. Students begin repaying their loans through the tax system once their income is above a defined repayment threshold. Loans must be repaid. Debt may only be cancelled under special circumstances. In addition to CSPs, there are also full fee-paying places which are not subsidised, although the majority of domestic bachelor students are enrolled on CSPs. It's about 20-1 is the ratio of CSPs to full fee-paying. And there are restrictions on which providers can offer these kinds of places. Now, in October 2020, the Australian Parliament passed legislation to reform higher education funding, including 2 things. 1, changes to the level of government grant funding by subject cluster based on updated cost data, so they changed the level of funding. And secondly, changes to the level of student contribution by subject cluster to reflect both the earnings following graduation and, crucially, labour market priorities. Following these reforms, student contributions to tuition costs have fallen in areas such as science, engineering and maths, subjects which the Australian government has identified as important to their economy and future needs. This means that some of the most expensive subjects to teach, which receive higher levels of government grant funding, now have some of the lowest fees, whereas students receiving the lowest level of government grant funding have the highest fees. In terms of maintenance support, Australia differs from England in that non-repayable support is available for all students under 25 through a means-tested youth allowance. So, Australia has a differential fee model, but one where student contributions do not correspond to the cost of delivery, supported through a mixture of government grants and student contributions. Second system, the United States. Although similar to English higher education providers in deriving large amounts of funding from tuition fee income, the structure and size of the US system is very different. Higher education in the US is, of course, decentralized along state lines. Public universities are funded and regulated by the states they reside in. The US government does not regulate higher education except in limited matters, but it is an important source of grant and research funding. This means that effectively there are 50 systems with varying costs and considerable diversity. Tuition fee for state universities are set at state level and differ depending on whether students are state residents or from out of state, and they're much higher for the latter. Private institutions, like those called the Ivy League, set their own tuition fees, which do not vary by state residency and can be much higher. I think the latest figure is $63,000 average annual fee for the Ivy League. These institutions Also, of course, have large endowments. Harvard's is just over 50 billion, which allows them to offer very generous financial aid packages to students in need. Like in England, and unlike in Australia, US universities tend not to vary undergraduate tuition fees by subject. To support students to meet tuition costs and educational expenses, federal government support is available to eligible undergraduates through either direct subsidised or direct unsubsidised loans. The difference is to do with means testing. Private loans are also widely available. Students are required to repay their loans, and for federal loans, there are 8 repayment plans, depending on loan type, borrower income, and borrower preference. This is a stark difference to the 3 undergraduate repayment plans in England, which primarily depend on when a student commenced study. And loans, of course, in England, are written off after a fixed period. The federal government also provides non-repayable grants, known as Pell Grants, to support undergraduate students from low-income backgrounds. So, in this example, we see high levels of individual investment supported through a complex and expensive student loan system. Third system is Germany. The most significant difference between Germany and the others discussed so far is that undergraduate tuition fees have been abolished, with the last state removing fees in 2014-15. Although universities in some states may charge students a small fee for some administrative and facilities costs, and one state has reintroduced tuition fees for students outside the EU-EEA. Responsibility for public education providers in Germany is held by individual states. Providers predominantly receive funding from the government of the state they reside in. Alongside its higher education system, Germany has a distinct and very strong vocational education and training system, with public funding provided at both the federal and the state level, as well as businesses contributing. Students can access financial support while studying, with initial eligibility informed by personal circumstances such as parental income and age. Support consists of a non-repayable grant and a zero-interest government loan. Repayment of the loan element starts 5 years after the end of the funding period, and students typically have 20 years to repay the loan. So, in this final example, we have a system which is essentially free at the point of delivery for students, funded through state grants. However, according to the OECD, the percentage of adults in Germany with a bachelor's or equivalent as their highest level of education completed is lower than in the US, Australia, and the UK, around 36%. So I've outlined the 3 systems. In my last minute, I want to touch on some of the benefits and some of the trade-offs of the key features we see in each. In Australia, the reforms have seen a shift in funding so that the student contributions have reduced for subjects of strategic importance, despite being more expensive to teach, with the aim of incentivising students to study these subjects. Whilst this approach is certainly interesting, the extent to which student behaviour and decision-making is affected by the price differential is not yet clear. The reforms have only just come into effect. In the US, higher levels of individual investment may be beneficial to the exchequer and to providers, but the upfront costs can still be high where students are supported by government loans. The complexity of this loan system and potentially high levels of debt may, as we've seen, have negative consequences on student choice, which need to be carefully considered. Finally, a German-style system, which is free at the point of delivery for students, has the benefit of low levels of debt amongst the graduate population and works well when complemented by a very strong technical education system. About 54% of German students undertake vocational training. However, depending on the desired scale of the system, noting the attainment rates in Germany that I mentioned earlier, the cost to government can be high and may need to be balanced against other government funding priorities. So, as we can see, there are various benefits and trade-offs in each system. And it's essentially this. It's a balance between who pays and how much do they pay, students and government, how they pay, grants or loans, and how much is paid for HE compared to other areas of the educational offer. And, of course, levels of participation and prioritisation of subjects need to be carefully considered against future skills needs if they can be known. Overall, then, higher education funding needs to be considered in the context of a wider skills system and the economy, which then shapes the system adopted. And that's what I think we're about to hear from our other contributors. Thank you.
We are indeed, Steve, about to hear. Thank you both, Steve and Karen, for a masterly piece of context setting of the complex problem that we're facing today. So now we're moving to three distinct and different proposals. The first up is Joe Johnson. Joe is chairman of the edtech company Future Learn, and he'll be speaking about linking funding to quality. Joe.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Sir Philip, and thank you, Policy Exchange, for inviting me to speak about what a good university funding system should look like and how we get through the impasse which we're presently in. I think just to start with some general sort of principles, what should a good funding system aim to achieve? I think there are three key things it's got to do. It's got to provide sufficient financial resources to maintain what is generally seen to be a world-class higher education system in the UK. It's got to do so in a way that's fair in terms of sharing the cost of that between the general taxpayer and the individual student. And finally, it's got to enable the Treasury to do all of that in a way that enables it to remove the financial and numerical barriers to access that would otherwise keep out the disadvantaged. So those are the three key things that a funding system has to do. My contention is that measured against those three goals, the system that Tony Blair introduced 25 years ago, which is, as we've heard, a time-limited and income-contingent graduate contribution towards the repayment of heavily subsidised tuition and maintenance loans, is the least bad of all available options. Now, there is essentially, to my mind, nothing wrong at all with our current model, except for what are two easily fixable flaws. First, as we've heard, the fact that the value of fees is being relentlessly eroded by inflation. The £9,250 fee is worth only £6,600 in the money of 2012-2013. And the second problem with our existing model is that there is no link between fees and the quality of education on offer. If you cast your mind back 8 years or so, now 5 prime ministers ago, to David Cameron's government, you will remember that attempts were made to address these two flaws in our system, with institutions offering high quality teaching and generating good student outcomes as measured by the Teaching Excellence Framework, would automatically be allowed to raise fees in line with inflation. Institutions that came in the top two categories, gold and silver, were allowed the full inflation uplift, while institutions in the third category, bronze, were to be allowed in time half of the inflationary uplift. Now, this mechanism, unfortunately, only operated for one single year, in 2017-18, whereupon Theresa May contrived to lose the Conservative majority upon which this policy depended. At the time, the demise of this mechanism was unlamented. First, no one really liked the accountability, the whole process of going through the TEF assessments, and the sector managed to produce all manner of objections to the TEF methodology. And second, in a low inflation environment, an extra £250 or so didn't really seem to be worth the bother. It was neither here or there to big institutions with budgets in some cases of over £100 million, or in some, maybe in the case of Durham, over £1 billion. My view is that we should have stuck with that approach. Had we done so, we wouldn't have all of the problems that we have today. University funding would be on a much more sustainable footing than it actually is. If you run the maths, Gold and silver rated providers would today be able to charge fees of around £12,200. That would have meant, to take an example, the University of East Anglia, which we read in the papers is suffering from very substantial deficits, would have an extra £38 million from undergraduate domestic tuition, more than enough to fill their financial black hole. And such a system, more importantly perhaps, by linking funding to quality, would align the interests of students, taxpayers, and providers in a highly desirable way. Now, I believe we're going to hear later about some of the other alternative models from other panelists, and I won't spend too long describing the advantages and disadvantages of them, and perhaps we can come to those in the question and answer. But my view very much is that there are serious disadvantages to the principal alternatives, what you might call Corbynism and Corbyn light. Corbynism being effectively free tuition, which would mean 100% taxpayer funding and the return of number controls to avoid undue pressure on the public finances. And the second alternative out there I see as the Corbyn light version, which is maintaining the present freeze on tuition fees, substituting that lost income in real terms with additional grant funding for high-cost subjects and other subjects, and slamming on number controls. And then the third option, and which we're also going to hear about, I believe, is the graduate tax, with all of the complexities that involves in avoidance, overpayment, and the flight of talented students to overseas universities. We can perhaps come back to the advantages and disadvantages of all of those models in the Q&A. But my principal point is that finding a funding system that protects both the student interest and the taxpayer interest, and making sure that they're properly aligned, is not actually that complicated. I don't believe, as Minouche Shafiq was arguing in the FT the other day, that we need another big review. I don't see the point of that. The mechanism to link funding to quality already exists in law, in the Higher Education and Research Act. That act allows fee caps to be set at differing levels based on a provider's TEF award, subject to overall limits, which would be prescribed in regulations scrutinised by Parliament. We should make full use of the provisions in HERA. Institutions that deliver great teaching and good student outcomes, as assessed by the TEF, when the next results come out this September, in 4 or 5 months' time, should be allowed to raise fees with inflation. Job done. And that would secure the 3 goals of a student finance system. The unit of resource would be protected going into our universities without the number controls that will constrain student choice and limit aspiration. It would be a system that fairly shares the burden of funding our great higher education system between the student and the taxpayer, and it would do so in a way that continues to ensure that we remove barriers to access for disadvantaged students. So I don't want you to think that I'm entirely complacent about our current funding model. I do recognise that it has not just the 2 flaws that I've mentioned, but also one very big additional flaw. And that's the fact that it hasn't worked well for adult learners, nor for lifelong learning. And the really big policy question today is how we adapt this student finance model, which Tony Blair bequeathed us, which the coalition has adapted, so that it genuinely promotes lifelong learning, not just first-time study by 18-year-olds. And the planned creation of a lifelong loan entitlement, which Sir Philip must take huge credit for because his review recommended it, represents a really welcome shift of emphasis in our system away from the dominance of the first-time learner in how we think about university funding. Sadly, I fear that we are in danger of missing this great opportunity. I think ministers need to grip the LLE policy development urgently if it is genuinely to be ready for delivery in 2025, 2026, as is the plan, and if it is actually to bring about the skills revolution they want. There are, to my mind, three big problems with the current policy development in the LLE. First, as the Vice-Chancellor Karen said just a second ago, it is ludicrous that the LLE, as presently conceived, focuses principally on level 4, level 5, ignoring altogether the need for greater skills at level 3 and the need for people already in work, graduates already in work, to upskill at level 7. Totally nonsensical to have a policy so restrictively focused as it presently is. Of course, I understand master's loans are already available through the SLC, but as currently available, they lack the flexibility needed for modular funding, micro-credentials, and learning over time. Second big problem with the LLE, as we're currently proposing to launch it, is the insistence that it must fund study that bears a minimum of 30 to 40 credits at a cost to the learner of £2,300 to £3,080. Those big chunks of study are too large for the needs we need to meet. They represent a barrier to the reskilling and upskilling that the policy is intended to promote. And other countries that have tackled lifelong learning have recognized this and fund smaller units of study worth perhaps 10 to 15 credits. And I think the government would be wise to go down a route of allowing smaller chunks of learning. Finally, and perhaps most fundamentally of all, learners desiring specific skills do not necessarily want just courses that are necessarily, as we are currently proposing it, derived from existing university qualifications. As Andreas Schleicher put it in his excellent recent HEPI lecture, individuals already in the workplace will want to pick from a wide range of micro-credentials, modules, and short courses to shape a program tailored to their specific needs, possibly spanning several disciplines and types of provider. This is surely what is needed, not more of the same university qualifications, but in smaller pieces. HEIs have no monopoly on work-relevant educational material, and it's a mistake for the government to allow the LLE to entrench them as gatekeepers to lifelong learning. So, provided these changes can be made to the design of the LLE, and provided we re-establish the link between funding and quality of provision via the TEF, I see no reason at all why our current system of income contingent loans shouldn't survive for at least another 7 prime ministers. Thank you.
We had some discussion before this session as to whether Joe would talk about the lifelong learning loan or linking funding to quality. He actually did both, but we're very grateful for that insightful contribution. Joe, thank you very much. We now turn to Justine Greening, former Secretary of State at no less than 3 government departments, former Minister for Women and Equalities, and Justine will be speaking about a graduate tax. Justine.
Right, good afternoon everyone, and great to see Sir Philip continuing to drive the debate on higher education. I, in a sense, want to, in the time that I've got, start at the beginning of tuition fees, and in a sense the issue that emerged actually very early on in the policy development, which is that the tuition fee approach was bounded on an assumption that there was a market for higher education, and that in pricing up degrees with a maximum price, that students would compete down those prices and that there would be competition across universities to put on better value courses. Actually, what happened was, it turns out that students essentially look at higher education as a giffen good. In other words, they associate quality with price, And therefore, all of that market-driven system to push down prices and to drive value for money in institutions was lost from the word go. And so, in a sense, I don't think I'm as far away from Joe, in a sense, as maybe the graduate tax point may suggest. I think that if we step back and look at what we're trying to do, it is about striking some quite difficult balances between choice and making sure choices are genuinely fair, between enabling a sector that I think has, more than any other in our country, driven social mobility over the last quarter of a century. I think the work that higher education has done on widening access, driving increased participation to a higher level in our education system, has been excellent and outstanding. I think the lack of learning actually from a wider country that now wants to level up is a real missed opportunity and should be focused on much more. But essentially, I come at this from the perspective that I don't think you need to almost reinvent a graduate tax. I think we essentially already have one in a way, which is the graduate contribution. My issue, in a sense, is with the student loan concept that artificially sits behind it. The sense that actually you are building up some kind of a debt that you are meant to pay off. And the way that happens is artificial, because you pay it off not based on how much you owe, you pay it off based on how much you're earning. And the interest rate on that debt isn't based on interest rates, it's based on inflation. So this is not a loan that works in any other way that we would understand it. So my proposal is that we scrap the loan. Stop pretending it's a loan. Just focus on the graduate contribution. And I should say at this point that it's worth also knowing just how much the student loan company costs us every year to send out those statements with the loan amounts and the interest calculated on it, which I know as a local MP can sometimes be got wrong. £300 million to administer a loan system that isn't really a loan system. And actually something that has ended up being part of a system that is dysfunctionally regressive, that because lower income students are less likely to be able to pay off their debt, and for various anti-social mobility structural reasons in the employment market, are less likely to go on to higher paying jobs, even when they outperform their more privileged peers. Actually, that means that it's the least privileged that are coming out with the biggest debts when they leave university, and that cannot be right. And at the extreme end of this, there is a small proportion of people who go into university and actually just pay the fees, don't even need a loan. So they pay zero interest on any of that and have zero loan, as it were, to pay back. So what I'm proposing is that you keep the graduate contribution system. It is essentially a graduate tax, but you make it more progressive. So you would have graduates paying that proportion, which Parliament could decide. We know what the percentage is at the moment, over that time limit, but it wouldn't be something that would stop when they would simply have paid it off, because we know that's actually why the current system is regressive in nature. So I think simply having it work as it does for many, many graduates already over a term limit of 30 years, 25 years, whatever Parliament decided on whatever rate, would transform it into a national insurance style contribution that enabled, as in Germany, an approach that was free at the point of delivery. I think it was a real shame, Philip, that one of your key recommendations on reintroducing maintenance grants was not taken forward. I think it's crucial that that is brought back. But if you combined that, then I think you actually genuinely would have a more progressive approach that would bring in more money, actually, to higher education, because you would have the best of people in society who have done the most well following their degrees, paying the most to help the next generation getting their degrees who follow them, and people like me, from very working class backgrounds, places like Rotherham, who nevertheless went on to do very, very well in a career in finance and industry, should be paying more than perhaps extremely privileged people who go to university but then go into becoming a nurse or a teacher or something that our society really needs. We have to, I think, focus back on the element of the system that, as Jo said quite rightly, actually does work, but make that more progressive. I think the advantages of this are you then decouple the question on how we fund particular courses from, if you like, the contribution that students are making, and that could become a much more evidence-driven debate. It could be focused on relative cost basis of university. It could, as Jo says, be focused on quality assessments of the courses that are being put on. But I think you could have a much more informed discussion between government of whatever tier, and perhaps it could be regionalised if we wanted it to be, between the funding that was coming into this higher education fund from graduate contributions, and that was then being divested out to different universities in relation to the courses that they were putting on. I think that funding could then be supplemented more effectively by a reformed contribution from employers. We already have a strategic contribution from skills to skills, which is obviously the apprenticeship levy. That is long overdue for reform. When I introduced it back in 2017, it was never meant to go this long without reform. The reality is that when you look at the lifelong learning entitlement, when you look at the skills through universities and the footprint of universities in vocational education and that partnership that in practice happens on the ground with many colleges, actually we do need to revisit that contribution from employers and look at that in the round alongside, in the case of what we're talking about at the moment, the contribution that students make themselves. So I think there are different elements, and if you did scrap, as it were, tuition fees and the loan, but keep the graduate contribution and make it more progressive, you would actually get students asking the right question about whether or not to go to university. Not, can I afford the tuition fees? Do I think that the loan is going to be something I can ever pay off? With all of the unknown issues, Laffer curve style, dare I say, a bit like the tax system, about what that might mean in relation to debt aversion and when that kicks in. Instead, you would have the right question asked, which is, given that I'm going to have to pay X% extra out of my pay for the next 25 or 30 years, or whatever Parliament decides, is it really worth doing this? And if the answer is yes, I think it's going to increase my earnings, then maybe paying 9 pence in the pound is probably not a bad deal. And you'll go and do it. But in a sense, it's stripping it back, I think, to a much smarter approach that is how we steer our way through it. My final point I would make for anyone who is conservative-minded in this room is that I also think what I've just said would be a vote winner, because at the moment there is a direct correlation between the drop-off rates of people voting Conservatives for the Conservatives and the proportion of those people in those generations who've been to university. And my party, I'm sorry to say, has seemingly turned its face on students and aspiration of students, this group in our society that actually put their hands in their own pockets to be able to get their education to go to that next level. I think it's time to make the system fairer for those high aspiration young people in our society that want to get themselves to university. And I think it's fair to recognise that they are willing to pay for that opportunity, but the way in which they do it should be much, much fairer. And I think if we can tackle some of those inequities for those generations and understand that this is a retail policy now, with around half the people in each generation now looking at university, I think if we can do that, then it not only makes the system fairer, I think my party will be able to connect to a new generation of voters for the right reasons, which is actually addressing a massive issue that younger generations in this country face, and that no one, neither my party nor the Labour Party, seems particularly capable or willing or ambitious enough to actually fix, but they now need to grasp that nettle. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justine. We turn now to our final speaker, Iain Mansfield. Iain is Director of Research and Head of Education and Science Policy here at Policy Exchange. He's a former Special Advisor at the DFE, and he will speak about student number controls. Iain.
Well, thank you very much, Sir Philip, and thank you to all of our previous speakers. To begin with, we've been speaking here about reductions in real terms funding, and that's obviously correct. But it is worth remembering that the amount of loan is forecast to increase from 17 billion annually in 2019-20 to 21 billion annually in 2024-25. And in fact, when you consider both grant and loan, the real-term values of the total funding received by universities increased in real terms every single year from 2011 to 12 to 2019-20. Now, how can we square the circle? I mean, it's very simple. It's student number growth. So we have a bifurcation. If you're a university, you are rightly seeing, as we heard from Professor O'Brien, real-term cuts every year, a real squeeze when based on, falling income and increased pension contributions and a high inflationary environment. If you're a student, you're seeing that your maintenance loan is not keeping pace with inflation. But if you're the Treasury, or if you're a taxpayer, you're seeing increasing outlay. Now, I think most people would agree that if we were putting more money into higher education funding, there are in principle three buckets of things that we might want to put that money into. We might want to increase the amount of funding per student, whether for all subjects, or maybe for some subjects that we thought were underfunded, or were of in particular demand, maybe STEM or medicine. Secondly, we might want to support students so that access to university was based on the ability to benefit, not on the ability to pay. So we might want higher maintenance loans or to bring back grants for the poorest students, as indeed our chair recommended in his report a few years ago. And thirdly, we might want to increase the number of places available so that more people could benefit from higher education. Now, in a normal world, we would sit down and debate where and how we wanted additional funding to be distributed amongst these three laudable goals. People like us would debate it, parliamentarians would get involved, and the government of the day would ultimately make its decision. It might also, as Sir Steve has said, wish to consider the balance of funding between higher education and further education, and where it would put additional funding between those two. This way, in which there are competing priorities, all of them good in principle, and choices must be made as to the balance of how much each one must be increased, is the way things normally work in terms of how public services are funded. But in higher education, over the last few decades, and particularly over the last decade, since the removal of number controls, we have chosen almost exclusively to put additional funding into numbers growth at the active expense of the other two goods, funding per student and maintenance support for students. So what have we gained from this? Well, we have gained some things. We have seen a significant increase in the number of people going to university. In the last decade, we've seen an almost 10 percentage point rise in the higher education initial participation rate. We've seen, and this is something which I welcome, as I'm sure many others do, an increase in the most disadvantaged people in society going, and that is a good thing. However, we do still have a third of graduates in non-graduate jobs. We have a fall in graduate premium. And that 10 percentage point increase in higher education participation has not had an observable impact on UK productivity. But so what has this chase for growth cost us? Well, in 1997, it cost us the dream of free higher education. Maybe an unrealistic dream, but there are many who still hanker for it. But tuition fees were introduced and they were trebled a few years later. In 2012-2013, we lost the principle that government would contribute significantly with grant to most higher education courses. We moved to a fully marketised system where for most courses, nearly all courses I should say, they were either solely or highly primarily funded by fee income. And in 2016, we lost maintenance grants for the poorest students. They had become unaffordable due to the pressures of increasing numbers growth and the jam needing to be spread ever more thinly. In particular, in this last decade, when controls were removed, we've not even been able to discuss this and have a choice of where to put the funding. We have removed all controls on numbers, and in consequence, we have seen significant real terms cuts to the value of the fee, which is worth only £6,600 today, almost 2/3 of what it was in 2012-2013. And we are now seeing, particularly last year, with a very low uplift to maintenance loans, we are seeing maintenance support falling increasingly behind the cost of living. And that is threatening to endanger the fundamental principle that access should be based on ability to benefit, not on ability to pay. How much more must we sacrifice to the idol of uncontrolled numbers growth? Well, I'll tell you one other thing that we've sacrificed, and that's further education. Since 2003, the amount of money spent on further education in real terms, in adult further education, has fallen by 2/3. It's quite stark. The line drops sharply under New Labour. It continues to fall sharply under the Coalition, and it continues to fall under the Conservatives. It does uptick very slightly after 2019 in response to Sir Philip's report and to the actions of some of the education secretaries since then. But this is still a sharp decline compared to 2003 and has been largely eroded by inflation. A recent calculation showed that this year the government is scheduled to spend 23 billion on higher education, about half of which will ultimately be repaid, but less than 5 billion on all of adult education in FE colleges and on apprenticeships. There's quite a stark difference there. Restoring student number controls is the only way to put the genie back in the bottle. I'd like to emphasise that controls do not mean cuts to student numbers. It may simply mean slower growth. There is nothing wrong with that. They're also compatible. In fact, I would argue they would help to bring in some of the changes which were proposed by the other speakers, such as linking fees to quality and raising them by inflation, or if we wished to move to a system of graduate contribution without upfront fees. I don't favour that approach myself, but if we did, controlling numbers would be essential to ensuring that universities did actually receive an increase in funding. I'd also like to challenge the idea, which is sometimes floated around, that these are somehow extraordinary or transgressive or impossible to implement, too technically difficult. We had these for decades until 2014. It was handled very sensibly, in which the government set out how many places it would fund. It would usually have a negotiation with the Treasury, the Education Secretary or the Universities Minister would discuss with the Treasury how many more places they could afford, bearing in mind the other things they wanted. And then the Funding Council, I guess now it would be the regulator, would determine how these additional places were distributed amongst universities. We have also still have number controls in further education. So there is not currently a level playing field at the moment between these two systems. One is controlled and funding is tightly limited. The other is uncontrolled, and so funding increases even if it gets spread ever more thinly to the detriment of those students who are currently studying. I believe that reintroducing number controls is the only sustainable means of unlocking significant additional investment per student into our university system, and also to restoring more generous maintenance support, whether by means of loans or grants to students. As I say, they are compatible with other solutions to this. They are not necessarily a standalone, or do not need to be a standalone measure. However, the removal of number controls, the uncontrolled number growth, has brought in an unsustainable funding system. We have paid for expansion by severe real terms cuts to the unit of resource and by cuts to the value of the maintenance support. By restoring number controls, we can ensure that the places we need are properly funded, properly resourced and properly supported. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Iain. We will now move into a Q&A session. I'll open the questions up to the audience in a moment, but first, if I may, I'd like to perhaps slightly abuse the position of chair by posing some questions to myself. I think few of us would disagree with Curran's opening proposition that HE is at a crossroads. Steve is not able to answer questions, or at least answer the questions that we'd really want to ask him. So if it's okay with you all, I'm going to pass straight on to our detailed proposals. I'm going to start with Joe, if I may. A very interesting proposition, Joe, which is essentially a quality-linked fee, a quality-linked fee rising with a TEF ranking. That, if I could crudely summarise your interesting proposition. Do you think that there should be any direction then for universities or students as to where that fee is spent? Which kind of subject it should be spent on?
No, I think the less sort of Tory gosplanning that goes on, the better generally in terms of telling students what to study, telling universities what to teach, what to research, the better. So my instincts are very much on the liberal side in this sense. And I think, you know, moving towards a world that Iain was sort of advocating, whereby we have number controls, would take us squarely into that territory of sort of delusional planning, whereby the Treasury and DFE start to allocate places around the system, telling people what skills they're going to need for the jobs of the future, and all other sorts of crazy nonsense. So very, very dangerous territory. I'd much prefer to focus on the student interpreting their own interests, working out how they're going to best expand their minds and take their own path in life, rather than people in DFE doing it.
So building on that, do you think that the taxpayer write-off matters then?
This is a big sort of error of conceptualising the subsidy in the system. It's a deliberate policy choice to have a substantial subsidy in our higher education system. It enables people to pursue socially useful but low-earning career paths. And, you know, if we didn't have this subsidy, we wouldn't have, you know, people able to go into careers in teaching and social work in the way they do. So it's a deliberate feature of the system, not a bug.
So do you have in mind any idea of what might be the right size of the write-off, or doesn't that matter?
I think the balance in between the individual and the taxpayer, you know, in terms of who pays the cost, should represent the split between the benefits towards society and the benefits to the learner. And when studies have been done on this, they come up with a range of answers to that question. Where we are at present is roughly, it was a 50-50 split. I think it's now the student paying a bit more than half of the cost of the system, and that seems to me reasonable. But I do really worry about this sort of bandwagon towards number controls as a solution towards this. I think it'd be a deeply, deeply regressive step for us to take as a society when we've still got a 30 percentage point participation gap between the most advantaged quintile and the least advantaged quintile in our society going to higher education. Throw on number controls maybe in 15 years' time when we've narrowed that gap more than we've managed to in the past decade. But to do so now would be the most anti-levelling up policy you could possibly come up with. And I think it would be a big mistake for the Conservative Party to advocate it.
What I'm trying to drive at is just simply the size of the write-off in terms of pound billions. There is so much the country can afford. Do you think there should be any control over that, or should that just be simply left to the choice of students and universities?
Well, at the moment, the write-off comes, you know, it's a sort of an annual fiction in the DFE accounts based on projections of what people are going to be repaying or not have repaid in 40 years' time. So I wouldn't get too worried about it.
But it's a prediction that crystallises it actually in annual accounts in real money.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, these forecasts of what people are going to manage to repay over the course of the next 40 years, I take them with a very large pinch of salt.
Thank you very much. I move on now to Justine and the proposal. The graduate tax. I mean, it's, as you outlined it, it's a hypothecated tax in effect. Calculated how? On earnings, or?
But it's literally, you literally just keep the graduate contribution but make it more progressive.
And
Simple as that. And you scrap the student loans companies, stop them sending out fake loan bills that upset everyone and aren't real. You probably pump that 300 million into widening participation. That would be good. So I think, you know, I'm just saying the reality is you focus on that and make that more progressive. So you're actually bringing more money into the system. So mine is the proposal that actually increases funding.
the Treasury would hate it.
No, they didn't. They actually quite liked it. So I came up with this originally back in summer 2017. We'd had that tough election, hadn't we, Joe, where people in my part of the country had been really upset with us for various reasons. And I realised simultaneously that not only had we politically really messed up, that we now had an unworkable student fee system, because we were never going to be able to get a statutory instrument regulation through Parliament ever again. So all of my concerns I'd had coming to the role about the fact that this was inherently fragile as a policy, and that was not a smart way to approach funding such a crucial sector like higher education, all of that turned out to be right. And we've never been able to move on since that moment. So I felt the best thing to do was a bit of blue sky thinking through talking to people like my local university and students there, and to kind of think, right, there are these jigsaw pieces, and the question is, how do they actually fit together in a way that align all the incentives rather than just some? That's what I came up with. I rang up my lovely private office and said, tell me why this is all rubbish, and I gave them till Christmas to break it. And they actually came back and said, no, it'll work. And Treasury liked it because, as I've just said, it will bring in more money. They always like more money.
I can't see any signs of an earthquake over at Horse Guards, so we'll move on to...
There I was doing their job for them. They were very happy about that.
Iain, student number controls, what are the criteria?
You would choose, in terms of the amount that the government would allocate, it would need to make a decision on how many it could afford, how much increase it could afford, just as it does in further education, just as it does when allocating budgets to NHS hospitals. And then it would be for a regulator, as it did for the decades up to 2014, to decide how they would be allocated to universities. I certainly don't think that ministers or DfE officials should be involved in deciding that, those at individual universities. And then universities, as now, should be left to autonomously decide their own admissions. And they could do that in well, we see a wide variety of approaches to admissions currently in the sector, which I've no doubt would continue.
So in your world, this would be a university by university number control.
We certainly would not want to get into the basis of deciding, this many for this subject here or that subject here. I mean, that'd be incredibly complex. It's not necessary to the core issue of affordability. It's not what we had in the past, and I certainly wouldn't advocate for that.
That is someone in Whitehall, and Joe would probably put this rather better than I can, but there is somebody in Whitehall forming a judgment on what the right number is.
There would have to be a judgment based on affordability, but I would go back. This is what we have in further education.
It doesn't work in FE. I'd just like to jump in. To hold up FE as a great model for number controls, I think, is misleading. It's not working in FE. FE colleges that are highly performing and want to expand can't, because they haven't got the numbers, and they have to go begging cap in hand to the ESFA and say, please, masters in Whitehall, give me some more numbers so that I can continue to expand my provision to the benefit of my local community and learners at this level. And the ESFA will take a very long time and perhaps give them an extra 1% the following year. So student choice gets completely lost in this system, and the market doesn't work. Good providers retain their numbers and continue to provide what might be mediocre offering. Excellent providers who want to expand can't.
I do hear what you're saying there, Joe, but I think one of the reasons why FE providers can't expand is because all that expansion has gone into HE, and that does have to be paid for by the Treasury. And having a more sensible discussion between the two sectors on it would be very, very helpful there.
Well, thank you. Sensible discussion. I'm all in favour of sensible discussion. Let's now have some of that by broadening the discussion to the audience. If you're in the room and would like to ask a question, raise your hand and a microphone will be brought to you. If you're watching online, raise a virtual hand and I will try and get to you depending on the numbers that we have coming forward. But so we do have a question in the room, in the penultimate row, please. Thank you.
Hiya. A question for Karen and maybe Steve, if you can answer it as the kind of Vice-Chancellors in the room. You've heard 3 options there. Do any of those actually solve the problem that you are facing as universities in terms of your kind of funding system?
So a question for Karen and Steve, as serving and past Vice-Chancellors, do any of the 3 proposals solve the problems that you face?
No. So student number controls, in the context of a very significant demographic spike, we're going to have an extra 700,000 applicants, 18-year-olds in the coming decade. And for the reasons that Joe outlines, I do think there will be unintended impacts in terms of social access. So that's one thing. And if you look across the whole world, as I said, the demand for tertiary education and higher education is increasing across the world, and young people want to go to university or to have tertiary education experience. So I don't think that's the answer. A graduate tax, we as universities will not have confidence in something that's hypothecated. We will not be reassured by that. But also, much more importantly for me, I've been an advocate, certainly since the Augar Review and before, for a much more flexible lifelong learning approach to higher education. We're very possessive in the elite universities in which I've worked, King's, I've worked at Oxford, Durham. Everything has to be a 3-year degree, a 4-year degree. We lock students in. I don't know how graduate tax is going to work if we are, as I think we should be doing, breaking up our qualifications and our modules into staged accessible bits, 30 credits or lower. So I don't know how that would work. And in terms of quality, I was on the original TEF panel. I did think a lot about quality. I do think you do need a way of cutting off and controlling some of the lower quality provision where you are encouraging young people to borrow large sums of money, or well, I know it's not quite a loan, but to take on what they will perceive as a debt for something that won't increase their earnings, that they may not complete, that won't be very high quality. But as a way of, again, kind of moving money around the sector, the incentive there would be to be a university that only puts on high value, kind of, high quality law degrees and social science degrees. And you get a very high quality point, you get lots of students, you get a higher fee. And what does that do for STEM? So my challenge as a Vice-Chancellor is very often not being able to afford the very high costs of high cost subjects. And again, a quality driver isn't going to get us there very easily.
Thanks very much. So I should have asked you to, could you identify yourself?
Sorry, Jess Lister from Public First.
Thank you very much. Steve, is this an area you feel able to comment on?
Yeah, I'll just say 2 very quick things. My experience as a Vice-Chancellor was really marked by this exact debate, and we now need to sort it for the reasons I'll come on to in a second. But the central problem, of course, was the current system was developed under one set of accounting rules, and they've changed. Mm-hmm. And I think the effect of that on the public purse has brought unintended consequences that weren't predicted at the time. The worry we always had about the graduate tax when I was a Vice-Chancellor was the hypothecation point. I mean, road tax was hypothecated, wasn't it, originally? I mean, that is a real issue, especially when universities are trying to plan. The more important point for me, certainly in my current role, is it used to be the old norm that international students cross-subsidised research. I chaired the transparent approach to costing exercise for 4 years, and that was the model. 49% surplus on international students, 30% deficit on research, 4% surplus on home students. Now, international students cross-subsidise all parts of university activity, and that's the issue we've got at the moment because of what inflation is going to do to the fee over the next couple of years.
Thank you very much. We'll take an online question from Helen Carasso of the Oxford Learning Institute. Helen, if you could remember to unmute yourself and put your question now. Thanks.
Hello. Can you hear me? Yes?
Yep.
Yeah, right. I'm at the risk of sounding like a scratched record, I'd like to ask why we're not considering the employer as one of the funders in this model. I mean, you go back to Deering, you go back to every review which says those who benefit should contribute to the cost, and employers do get direct benefit from having a skilled and educated workforce. Of course, they pay something through general taxation, but so does everybody. So that doesn't seem to me that solves the problem.
Thank you very much. The question was really about the dog that didn't bark in the night, the employer's contribution. Justine, it's a point you raised. Would you like to elaborate on that?
I think Helen's spot on. I think we need to have a strategic discussion with employers on skills and education funding. It's as simple as that. And I could see a way by which it could complement existing money going into universities. There's already many companies that pay for bursaries and have all sorts of approaches. So I'm just simply saying that you create a more holistic levy for them to be able to have greater decision-making powers. And I think in terms of all Joe's very sensible sound points on lifelong learning entitlement, you know, as we look towards a world of micro-credentials and all of that, actually employers probably will be the people who really bring the investment for their own staff to turbocharge that.
Thanks very much. One more question from in the room, please, on the same side as before. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Charles Pender. My credentials here are perhaps slightly different because I'm not a producer, I'm not a financer, which is sort of what the people on the panel are, whatever. I am a consumer, both originally and in terms of a parent of one actually who's been FE and one in higher education. And my perspective in terms of the present system, it is totally dysfunctional. And I cannot see how Joe can sit there and say, you know, he wants just to tweak it, because it's impossible to make rational decisions under this system. And I give an example of the people who been mentioning it, a few people who pay as they go. You know, I worked in the city, I have a lot of friends who are quite well paid. The norm tends to be that they say, oh, I'm not going to burden my children with these loans. You know, they might take out the loan originally, but they put it in ISAs and then hope that they can make enough money to pay it off at the end, or some just pay it straight off. And if you're actually looking at it from the youngsters' point of view, how can they rationally know whether, I mean, if they are fortunate enough, perhaps they've inherited a bit of money from a grandparent or something, how can they rationally know whether they should take out a loan or not? And they're told, you know, it's 12% interest or something, and then perhaps it's 7%. So there's no way you can make rational financial decisions on it, which is a very bad start to one's working life financial. So whatever system we do, and I'm attracted certainly by some, I would have been against graduate tax, but I think if it's done in the right way, it could be. You've got to have something which is simple enough for youngsters to and indeed their parents have a chance of understanding what the rational choices are.
Thank you very much, Charles. Joe, would you like a quick response there?
Yeah, sure. I mean, just can I quickly come in on the employer point, and then I'll try and address that. I mean, I very much agree that the LLE is a big opportunity to crowd in more employer support for lifelong learning. At present, the apprenticeship levy is not really working as a system. It's too narrow. I think there is a strong argument to be made for expanding the apprenticeship levy to become a growth and skills levy, so that non-university courses can be funded through the LLE. Employers could double their contribution quite easily to 1% of their turnover, in order to ensure that, you know, we don't lose apprenticeship funding but create funding for lots of other relevant training for the workplace. On the points that were just made there about sort of the confusing nature of the student finance system, you know, I think the best advice is, you know, to look carefully at the loan when you're taking it out. Read the fine print. Inform yourself about the product. Inform yourself about the quality available in the institution you're thinking of studying at. Look at the outcomes. Look at the teaching quality there. That's partly what the TEF is meant to assist students doing. They should take advantage of the signals that are available about where good outcomes are available in our system.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much. I'm afraid we're going to need to draw a line under it there. Thanks are due to everyone, really. Thanks to you all for coming, actually and virtually. I'm sorry if I didn't get round to your questions. We've simply run out of time. Thanks again to Durham University. Thanks to Policy Exchange for putting this on, and particularly to Iain, who's been the brains behind it. I think there's scope for another one of these, Iain perhaps addressing the FE question this time. It would be nice to see that get equal mileage. But above all, thanks to our really terrific speakers who've generously given their time and their expertise in some really, really interesting observations and solutions to an incredibly complex question. Thank you to our speakers.